just looking at the standards, one of the things that is really important in the Tezuku handmade Kamishibai movement is the idea of doing personal stories, stories related to your locality, your history, local history. A lot of kids are involved with this. Like, I saw a wonderful one where this statue, I think of an Ojizo-sama, a little Buddha, had been left out in the street. Usually they would move that. And there was a whole story behind, the significance of that for that area. So they developed Kamishibai around that story because the kids came into the library asking, why is that left there? So there's so many questions about your own neighborhood, your own, history that as kids become curious about it and do research about it, make wonderful Kamishibai stories. So to combat, the kind of response I told you about at the beginning that Kamishibai is only good for Japanese folktales. Certainly it's good for that too. But that the memoir is a very important genre over there. I worked with 7th graders to develop personal stories. And I was thinking, I want them to get all those same kinds of visual techniques that we talked about to build suspense in their own stories. So what's a good way to do that? And I think, too, the more research you read about how the brain remembers things, the more you realize it's connected to emotion and finding that emotional hook to that information, whatever it is. History can be super dry, but if you find out my grandfather was part of that battle, then it suddenly becomes really important to kids, right? So Kamishibai, because it's all about capturing that emotion, getting people mesmerized by it, I thought it would be a good way to get people to think about their own lives and developing a story. So one of the things that I got the kids to think about was, is there a story in your life where when you remember it, you automatically zoom in? There are moments in your life that were so intense that you're actually zooming in your memory of it, right? So I got them to think about that first and work with it as a movement over index cards. So this was my example. I have a slide, and then I zoom in as things come down. Okay, so that's the same technique you saw in the fox one. And I wanted to keep it very abstract because I didn't want them to guess who in the story was involved. Then I have them, and we're going to be doing this today. I'll skip over the index card part. I'm going to give you a much bigger paper. But I mapped out my story for myself on a paper. And then we developed the story, finding peaks in our stories and and using this technique. So this was the story I finally came up with, and I will need someone to give it a videos. A child trapped within, written and illustrated by Carl and Mallard. Long, long ago, when I was in 2nd grade, I had to go to public school for the first time. Up to that point, I had been homeschooled in a big farm in Vermont, where we got to make maple sugar, and we got to play with the animals, and I knew all my teachers. I'd known them my whole life. But starting today, I would have 2 teachers who were total. In the morning, I had Mrs. Presbury. She was young and beautiful, like a fairy tale princess. She let us read on beanbag chairs, and she always had a good word to say. She usually had her arms around someone or other in the class. But in the afternoon, we had Mrs. Cummings. One more word out of you, young lady, and you'll have your head on the desk for the rest of the afternoon. No matter what I did in Mrs. Cummings' class, I seemed to spend every afternoon in complete darkness with my head on. After what seemed like forever, I would hear a voice say, "Tara, is that you with your head on your desk again?" And I would look up and see Mrs. Preston. "Oh, why don't you come over and help me clean the art supplies?" Oh, I was so happy I ran and followed her back to her room. Why couldn't all teachers be like Mrs. Preston? I grew up in northern Vermont near Canada, where every winter the snow piles high on everything, and the playground equipment was always strictly off limits. It wasn't just that we could slip and hurt ourselves. We had all heard stories about getting our tongues stuck to the metal. But that didn't bother us, because as soon as the snow plows came by, we had huge mountains of snow to play with. We would make snow forts, have snowball games, and my favorite thing was to slide down through the tunnels. But I was always a little worried that I might get stuck inside. One day, when it was 50 below and were all reading quietly at our desks when suddenly my best friend, Casey Lemieux, pointed out the window and said, "Hey, everybody, someone is on the slippery slide." We all ran to the window. "Hey, I bet it's your older brother." "No, I bet it's your older sister." We all had older siblings in the middle school nearby. When we got to the window and looked out, we could see it wasn't a second grader. We saw the person climbing up the slippery slide, and then we looked closely, but they were so covered in coats and scarves and hats, we couldn't figure out who it was until we got to the very top. Oh my gosh, it was Mrs. Cummings! We couldn't believe our eyes. We were all in shocked silence. And when we saw her go down to the bottom of the slide, we could see she hadn't fallen well. Just then we heard, "Children, go back to your desks immediately. I'll come back right away." Mrs. Presby was running out of the room. It was several weeks before we saw Mrs. Cummings again. And when we did, she had a cast all the way up to her hip. She had to keep her feet propped up on pillows. Well, this would have been a perfect opportunity to get away with all kinds of things. But for some reason, we didn't. I think we finally realized that it wasn't that Mrs. Cummings didn't want to play. She'd just forgotten how. Even today, when I see scary and cross, impatient people like Mrs. Cummings, I think to myself that just like Mrs. Cummings, they probably have a child trapped within. A little girl who probably liked to sled and throw snowballs and make forts. And I often think to myself, if only she could have let that little girl out more often, we could all have been good friends. So then I get, did that really happen? Did that really happen? So this was one way to get kids to think in terms of themselves as a character and also an emotional peak in the story, which is really difficult. I mean, even for seventh graders, I find it difficult even at this age. But personal storytelling involves objectifying yourself enough to see yourself as a character in the story. So we worked on that. But again, you know, if you're working on histories, it doesn't have to be your own. You can do whole town histories or whatever this way. And then, of course, I wanted to do something more scientific. I was really getting to this informational but, question. And so I had seen a lot of documentaries on crows, and I just love crows. So every time I work with a group of kids on developing their own Kamishibai stories, I make my own because